Welcome into another episode of Tailgate Talk SEC. I am Will Thomas, and today we're going to go through what happened at the SEC spring meetings just earlier this week. So down in Destin, all the coaches got together, all the media got together, and it was a kind of sort of like a check-in, right? At least with the media in terms of, how the season's going or how the offseason is going. But really what happened more was a lot of questions about the current state of the sport and a lot of the main debates around the current state of the sport, mainly playoff expansion and also NIL is out of control, all that. Rev share, it's what's going on. So we're just gonna go through all the meaningful nuggets that we got from a bunch of coaches. Go through one coach who I believe who won me over for the rest of my life because of what he was saying. So let's start there. Actually, let's start with the headliner of the whole week for me, who was Mike Elko. Texas A&M's head coach. I thought gave incredible answers to every single question that he was asked. And starting off with just the NIL problems, he was quoted saying, if we don't find a way to create some level of regulation in the market, a lot of people are going to go bankrupt pretty quick. We're 2.5 years away from having an NIL budget that is greater than the TV revenue for our entire university. Now, obviously, this is what Signetti came out and talked about just yesterday, but just the money that teams are spending on their rosters, it's a lot, obviously, but it's also becoming a borderline too much for the entire school to handle. Because now that it's an arm race and a bidding war for every single player, people are just outspending their university's budgets practically. Which is why so many of these coaches are going for, NIL reform. Not even reform, sorry, but just control, structure, and just limits on what can happen because it's really hard to stop spending money when you know that it's kind of for your job, for a championship. And sort of Kirby said the same thing, or a similar thing. He said, my biggest concern for our sport is we're going to ruin all the other sports. We're going to keep, he's talking about non-revenue sports, Olympic sports at these colleges, quoted saying, we're going to lose that if we keep spending. Because all of the money that is going towards, an edge rusher or a wide receiver is going away from, the tennis program or the swimming program. Like you saw Arkansas, they had to get rid of a sport recently. They were able to bring it back, but you have schools who are literally losing other sports because football budgets are spending so much money on players in the portal and out of high school, and it's kind of crazy. So that was most of what we got from coaches about NIL and all, just the meaningful comments about spending and roster construction. We got a good bit about the playoff, a really good bit about the playoff. So obviously these coaches were all asked, what they think about staying at 12, going to 16, 24, maybe even beyond. And while the majority of ADs want something larger than 16, that's not quite what we got from coaches. Obviously, some are still in favor, but we got some pretty good responses, through the eyes of those who don't really want the expansion. So going back to Mike Elko, his answer to that question was, what does Mike Elko want? 40. Then I won't get fired. It's okay to make it hard to make it to the playoff. None of us are answering for the good of the sport. We're answering for the good of ourselves. Elko said what everybody who's been arguing against expansion has been saying for a while. And that is that coaches and ADs who want an expanded playoff, they're doing so because they think that making the playoff and being able to put that on their resume is going to give them better job security. First off, I don't think that's true. And we'll get into that in a second. And second of all, that is, like Elko said, selfish benefit and not actually for the good of the sport. Why I think it's not true is because, like Brent Venables, he made the playoff last year and they lost that home game to Alabama. It was a good season, and he's not going to get fired over that. But if he struggles this year, I don't think he can point to losing a home playoff game as a reason why he should stick around. And that's with 12. So if you go to 24, and let's say you have, let's say it is Elko, just for the sake of the argument, because he said this quote. Let's say A&M is the 23rd best team in the country. They went 9-3 or 8-4, and then they get popped in the first round of the playoff. That's not job security. No A&M fan is going to be happy with a 23rd ranking season if it means losing in the first round of the playoff. They're not going to be happy with that just because there was a CFP logo on their jersey. It means less. You expand the playoff, you put more spots in there, the value of a playoff spot decreases. It's supply and demand, guys. This is literally the first thing you get taught in any business class. As things grow up, as things blow up, and you have a higher quantity, the value goes down. So no, when you go to 24, if you go at 24, the value of a playoff spot is not as high as it was at 4 or even at 12 to where you keep your job. That's a stupid argument. It's a dumb argument. Elko also said, you guys act like we're the ones figuring stuff out talking about coaches. We're not figuring anything out. And then he was asked follow-up, are their voices being heard by ADs, the coaches' voices? And he said, no, have they ever been? So Elko was really out for blood. at the spring meetings. I liked it a lot because we're at a point in the sport where people, they need to really stand their ground and be aggressive, be assertive if we want actual positive changes to come from the sport. Florida's head coach John Summerall also had something to say about the 2014 playoff. Talking about just the expansion and the growth of access. Access is nice to have when you're at that level. Talking about G6 when he was back at Tulane. I do think I've been on both sides of this now. Are there two deserving G5 or G6 teams in a 12-team playoff? I would question that. And he also said, I'm for playoff expansion. More football is good football, in my opinion. And he leans 24 teams. And, he said that he hears the talk of watering down the product, but he has a hunch that people will still watch. And just in retort to that, people will still watch the football games, but that's not really what we're worried about. I mean, obviously people are going to watch the football games, but they're going to mean less. So the value as a consumer is lessened. That doesn't mean that people aren't going to watch the games. You also have people watching the games, but objectively, there will be less nationwide interest in more football games if the stakes are dropped. That's just how it works. And in terms of what he said about, are there two G6 teams worthy of a 12-team playoff spot? Hearing him say that is, really important because he was one of the two G6 coaches who made the playoff last year. So even he made it, and he's admitting, I don't know if there are two G6 teams that deserve that spot. So that's kind of counterintuitive to me what Summerall said between, there aren't that many teams at the non-power level who are worthy of a playoff spot while also going for expansion. I'm not totally sure where Summerall's at with that, but that was an interesting comment from him, I thought. Then Sarkisian, head coach of Texas, he had something to say about it. And he said on the college football playoff, I watched a coach get fired 5 games into a season last year after being in the semifinals the year before. That's concerning to me about the health of the sport. So he's talking about James Franklin at Penn State, who was fired last year early on in the season after the bottom fell out, and he made the semis in 2024. Nobody ever respected the Penn State run to the semis. They beat SMU at home, and then they beat Boise State at a neutral site. That was never a semifinal run that anybody who, with a rational view of the sport was like, wow, what a run from Franklin and the Nittany Lions, man. It wasn't real. It wasn't real. So I don't really agree with Sarkisian there, saying, because if Sark went to the semifinals, but he beat, I don't know, who was saying he beat? He beat a Michigan, and then he beat an Oregon. That's entirely different. It's entirely different than what Franklin did. Nobody respected Penn State's semifinal run, and they got beat by Notre Dame. No one really saw that and it was like, man, dude, Franklin's right there. He's knocking on the door. It was 2 soft wins, and they got beat by a good team. So I don't really agree with that at all. But his point about being concerned about the health of the sport obviously is a good one, because we're in a playoff or bust sort of situation, which is kind of why Franklin got fired, because he made the playoff last year, or 2 years ago, and then it was clear they weren't making it the bottom fill out, and they canned him. But if we're worried about playoff or bust now, imagine how bad it's going to be when the field is 24 teams. Because then anybody at the power level, the expectation is that you can finish the season ranked. So when you can't do that, there's no room to build for 3 years and to make the playoff. You won't be given that time because of how much easier it's going to be to make the field. So expanding the playoff would make what Sarkisian is worried about even worse. 24 teams, it's not a good idea. Kalen DeBoer and Brent Venables of Bama and Oklahoma, I thought had really, really good points about this. Kalen DeBoer asked about expansion. For me, it's not really about a number. It's about just trying to win every football game so we don't have to put it in a committee's hands. Venables said, if you want to be in complete, total control, win your games. It worked in our favor in November, where we had a really challenging last 4 games, and we took care of business. Thank you. Just win your football games, and the size of the playoff field doesn't matter. That's all you have to do. Everybody who's clamoring for expansion is either a fan or a part of a team that doesn't win their football games. So they want to be just given a meaningless playoff spot to make themselves feel better. That's not competitiveness. That's being soft. And if we have soft people who don't want to actually fight for championships in charge of the sport, then that's where we're going. And we can't do anything about it. But if actual competitors and people who wanted to be great and people who wanted to actually earn championships, not just be handed things to make themselves feel better, we're in charge of making decisions, we'd still be at probably 8 teams in the playoff, and we'd have a much better product. Sure, access is great. Everybody has access now because everybody can pay players and pay coaches and get great rosters. If you want to win a championship, invest and spend your money well. Spend your money responsibly. and then you can compete. Indiana won a national championship in 2 years. You want to tell me there's no access to the playoff? The losingest program in the history of the sport went from nothing to playoff to natty. There is so much access. There's tons of access. Texas Tech, in 1 or 2 years, turned it around. Now they're a perennial playoff threat. There is enough access as is. Win your football games, and you'll get into the playoff. This was not meant to be an anti-2014 rant, but we got there. But just what a few other coaches said. Clark Lee of Vanderbilt, he was just kind of asked about the Commodores' expectations, right after being able to turn that program around, have the winningest season in Commodore history last year, and he said, you live in the wake of what you create. I've been up here as a 2-win coach. I like being up here as a 10-win coach. And he had that he didn't come to Vanderbilt for a 10-win season. I came to win a national championship. I know we have ground to cover to do that. Looking ahead to Vandy's season this year, obviously I'm very excited about what Clark Lee is doing there. I think he is the right guy. I think you're in a step back year for the Commodores, but you're losing Diego Pavia, you're losing Eli Stowers, you're losing a couple of guys on that defensive front. It's just natural. It's the natural course of football. And you're going to see a lot of overreactions about how Vandy was a one-hit wonder. All of a sudden, you're going to hear a lot of people saying how important Pavia was after hearing how bad he was off last year from the same people. Doesn't matter. But, you're going to have to be patient with Vanderbilt this year because they have Jared Curtis in there. The recruiting is leveling up. The portal recruiting is leveling up. So you're going to get a lot of talk this year, I think, about how Vandy was a one-hit wonder, how they're still back to the same old Vanderbilt. They're not. They're just not. And you'll have to wait and see for that. Alex Golish. He kind of gave a sombering point of view when he was just about the playoff. He just said, nobody in that room cares what I think about the college football playoff. The CFP is literally the last thing I thought about since I took the job at Auburn. I like this perspective a lot as well, right? Because it's things that are out of head coaches' control. They can talk about it, they can lobby for it, but like Elko said, and like Golish is saying here, no one really cares. The head coach's job is to go win football games. And that's clearly what Golish is prioritizing. Because the CFP, he said, is the last thing he's thought about. Because he's been thinking about his roster construction, his team, his staff. He's just thinking about how can he have the best football team to go win enough games to where the committee has no choice but to put them in. That is the right attitude to take. So we got some good nuggets from a bunch of SEC coaches, but going into the week, we kind of knew that we weren't going to get a decision. We weren't going to get a vote. We weren't going to get much clarity. Because obviously this is an issue that a bunch of people are split on. I mean, a good bit of ADs, a good bit of coaches do want something more than 16 up to 24. But it wasn't enough to get a vote. And Greg Sankey is against it. We know that. So obviously there's still a long way to go in terms of playoff decisions, NIL decisions. The Protect College Sports Act kind of came out to where they couldn't really talk about it in Destin, but that will obviously be a topic of conversation down the line. We got a lot of good nuggets. We got a lot of, we got to have our finger on the pulse of where a bunch of these coaches stand. And whenever you get all these guys in the room, you get a bunch of pretty good nuggets and a lot of good insight into how these guys interact with each other. So it was good to see. And we have Media Days coming up in July, so we'll get some more nuggets there. But thank you guys so much for watching this episode of Tailgate Talk SEC. If you do want more college football content, SEC content, every single day up until we kick off, subscribe to me here and follow me on Twitter. I've been Will Thomas, and I will see you next time.